I carried a secret that, by God's command and unexpected circumstances, placed me before the greatest dilemma one could face: risk my own life to save my people or remain silent and watch their destruction. This is my story, how a common, unknown young woman, in the midst of one of the most powerful courts of antiquity, found the strength and courage to change the fate of an entire nation. My life changed the day the royal guards knocked at the door. Before that, I was just Esther, a young Jewish woman living in Susa, under the loving care of Mordecai, my cousin. He had raised me as his daughter after the death of my parents. Our home was simple, but full of stories and teachings about the God of Israel. Mordecai always said, "God has plans for each of us, even when we don't understand why." I didn't understand the depth of those words until that day. The guards, sent by King Xerxes' decree, were gathering young women from across the empire for the royal harem. Vashti, the former queen, had been banished, and the king was looking for a new wife. My heart sank when I heard this. What could I, a common young woman, do in a place so far removed from my reality? Mordecai led me to a corner of the house, his eyes shining with restrained emotion. "Esther," he said, holding my hands, "listen carefully. Do not reveal to anyone that you are Jewish. Be wise and remain silent. God has a purpose for all of this, even if we do not understand it now." I was taken to the palace at dawn, nervously walking through the ornate gates. It felt like entering another world, a place where everything was opulent and exaggerated. The corridors were decorated with silk tapestries, while the scent of spices and fresh flowers filled the air. Despite the beauty, I felt out of place, as though I didn't belong in that world. Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the harem, was a serious yet fair man. He watched me closely from the start. "You have something special," he said, placing me under his direct care. I didn't know what he saw in me, but I followed his guidance. The following months were a tiring routine of preparations. Every movement, every word, was rehearsed. I adapted slowly, but I missed Mordecai and my old life. The weight of the secret about my identity was constant, but Mordecai's words echoed in my mind: "Trust in God's purpose." Then came the day when I was summoned to the presence of King Xerxes. I dressed simply, following Haggai's advice. When I entered the throne room, silence fell. Xerxes looked at me with curiosity, as though trying to understand something he hadn't seen in the other young women. After a moment, he smiled. "She is different," he said. In that instant, my life changed forever. My coronation was a grand event. The palace hall was decorated with rare flowers, while musicians played soft melodies. People clapped, but I felt like an actress in a play I didn't fully understand. The crown on my head was heavy, not just physically, but emotionally. Who was I in that moment? Esther, the young Jewish woman, or Hadassah, the queen of the Persian Empire? The days that followed brought a routine filled with responsibilities and ceremonies. My relationship with the king was cordial but distant. Xerxes was a complex man, alternating between moments of generosity and bursts of temper. He treated me with respect, but I knew his trust was fickle. I couldn't forget what had happened to Vashti. Sometimes, we would walk together through the palace gardens. "You are an intriguing woman, Esther," he once said, while watching the flowers bloom. "You don't strive to stand out, and maybe that's what I admire about you." I simply smiled, keeping my responses brief. I couldn't allow myself to reveal more than necessary. In moments of solitude, I thought of Mordecai and my life before the palace. He would come frequently to the palace gates, but we couldn't speak. Yet, in one of those silent encounters, our eyes met. It was enough to remind me of who I was and what was at stake. At night, while gazing at the stars from my room, the question always returned: why did God place me here? Silence seemed to be the constant answer, but I knew I had to trust. Mordecai was right. God had a purpose, even if it was still hidden from me. The days in the palace were a careful dance of words and actions. I walked a thin line between power and danger. Every decision was calculated, and the weight of the secret about my identity grew heavier. But for now, I continued to play my role, waiting for the moment when everything would make sense. Months after my coronation, a new name began to resonate throughout the palace: Haman. He had been promoted to a prominent position, becoming the second most powerful man in the empire. His presence was as dominant as it was disturbing. When I first saw him in the great audience hall, I immediately felt a chill. He had an arrogant, almost theatrical bearing, and every movement seemed to demand that everyone around him recognize his importance. Haman was relentless. His pride overflowed, and he demanded reverence from everyone, even the officers and servants at the palace gates. That's when I learned of the conflict between him and Mordecai. My servants came to whisper to me that Mordecai refused to bow before Haman, openly defying the king's decree. My heart tightened when I heard that. Knowing Mordecai, I knew he wouldn't yield, no matter the risk. I sent a messenger to him, asking him to explain why he was acting that way. His response was direct: "I will not bow before a man. Only the Lord God is worthy of my reverence." His words, though courageous, made it clear how serious the situation was. He was facing someone who did not tolerate opposition. Enraged by Mordecai's defiance, Haman devised a plan that went beyond personal revenge. He convinced the king to issue a decree ordering the annihilation of all Jews in the empire. Using duplicitous language, he described our people as different and dangerous. Xerxes, uninterested in the details, trusted Haman and gave him the royal ring, granting him full authority. When the decree was announced, panic spread quickly. In a single day, men, women, and children would be exterminated. The news reached me like a blow. Mordecai, upon hearing of the decree, tore his clothes, covered himself with ashes, and went to the palace gates to mourn publicly. The pain and urgency in his actions were clear. I sent him clothes, hoping he would compose himself, but he refused. Instead, he sent a message that would stay engraved in my mind: "Do not think that, because you are in the palace, you will escape. If you remain silent now, deliverance and salvation will come from another place. But who knows if you were not made queen for such a time as this?" Mordecai's words echoed in my mind like an incessant drum. Who knows if you were not made queen for such a time as this? I knew he was right. What I feared wasn't the calling, but the weight of responsibility. How could I, alone, save my people? And if I failed? The consequences would be terrible. But Mordecai was right on another point: I was not safe. Being queen didn't mean I was immune to the laws of the empire. Approaching the king without being summoned was a crime punishable by death unless he extended the golden scepter. Xerxes was unpredictable. Even after months in the palace, I could not predict his reaction. Still, the alternative of remaining silent was worse. I sent a reply to Mordecai: "Gather all the Jews in Susa and fast for me for 3 days. I and my maids will do the same. After that, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. If I perish, I perish." The 3 days of fasting were the hardest of my life. My body was weak, but my spirit was more alert than ever. As I prayed, scenes from my childhood with Mordecai came to mind, him teaching me about the great heroes of our faith, like Moses and David, who faced impossible challenges. Could I do the same? On the morning of the 3rd day, I put on my royal robes. The maids adjusted the crown on my head, and each of their movements seemed laden with expectation. Looking at my reflection in the mirror, I saw a queen, but also a frightened woman. My hands trembled, but I whispered the words that sustained me: "If I perish, I perish." The walk to the throne room seemed endless. Each step echoed like thunder in my mind. When the doors opened, the hall fell silent. All eyes turned toward me. The king was sitting on his throne, looking at me with a mix of surprise and curiosity. My heart beat so loudly that I thought everyone could hear it. Then, the impossible happened. He extended the golden scepter. A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew this was only the beginning. I walked toward him, knelt, and touched the tip of the scepter. "What is it you wish, Queen Esther?" asked the king. "Even up to half the kingdom will be granted to you." I chose my words carefully. "If it pleases the king, come, you and Haman, to a banquet I have prepared for you today." The king nodded, intrigued, but accepted. Haman, called shortly thereafter, seemed radiant with the invitation. But for me, this was just the first move in a much larger game. That night's banquet was fit for a king. The tables were covered with hand-embroidered cloths, filled with refined dishes and golden cups that gleamed in the torchlight. Exotic fruits, fragrant meats, and spices filled the room with tempting aromas. Every detail had been carefully planned, but within me, a battle raged. The tension consumed me. The king arrived first, wearing his royal robes. He seemed relaxed, enjoying the opulence of the feast. Haman entered shortly after, his walk full of confidence. He looked around the room, clearly convinced that this banquet was a celebration of his power. But for me, every detail of that moment was a prelude to what was to come. As the wine was served, Xerxes smiled at me. "Queen Esther," he began, his voice warm, "this is a magnificent banquet. Tell me, what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom will be granted to you." I had practiced my response countless times, but something inside me whispered, "Wait." It wasn't the right moment. "If it pleases the king," I said, keeping my voice calm, "come, you and Haman, to another banquet I will prepare tomorrow. Then I will make my request." The king nodded, intrigued but without questioning. Haman seemed even more satisfied, leaving the banquet with a smug smile. He believed his position was unshakable, but little did he know what the next day would bring. After the banquet, I retired to my chambers, where I fell to my knees. "Lord," I prayed, "I trust in you. Give me strength to face what is to come." As I sought courage, something unexpected was happening in the palace corridors. Xerxes, unable to sleep, asked for the royal records to be read to him. A forgotten detail caught his attention. Mordecai, the man who had saved his life by exposing a conspiracy, had never been rewarded. "What honor has been given to this man?" the king asked. When he learned that nothing had been done, he decided to correct the oversight immediately. The next morning, Haman was summoned to the king's presence. He entered confidently but was surprised by Xerxes' question, "What should be done for the man the king desires to honor?" Haman, believing the king was speaking of him, suggested, "This man should be dressed in royal robes, mounted on a horse of the king's, and led through the city while a herald proclaims, 'This is what is done for the man the king desires to honor.'" The king smiled. "Excellent. Do this for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Do not neglect a thing." Haman's face turned pale. He had no choice but to carry out the order. So, he was forced to lead Mordecai through the streets of Susa, proclaiming his honor. For Haman, it was the ultimate humiliation. For me, it was another sign that God was preparing the ground. The second banquet was marked by almost palpable tension. While the first had been luxurious and enjoyable, this one was heavy with expectation. The king seemed more curious than ever, and Haman, though trying to maintain his usual arrogance, showed signs of discomfort. He knew something was beyond his control. When the wine was served, the king looked at me intensely. "Now, Queen Esther, tell me, what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom will be granted to you." It was the moment I had been waiting and praying for. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility in my words. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, I ask that you spare my life and the life of my people. For we have been sold to destruction, annihilation, and death." The whole fell silent. The king's face hardened. "Who would dare to do such a thing?" he asked, his voice deep and filled with indignation. I pointed to Haman. "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Haman froze, unable to respond. The king's expression changed from surprise to fury. He abruptly stood and left for the gardens, likely to contain his anger. Haman, realizing the gravity of his situation, threw himself at my feet. "Please, Queen Esther," he begged, his voice full of desperation, "save me." When Xerxes returned and saw this scene, he interpreted it as an attack. "He dares to assault the queen in my own house," he shouted. It was the end of Haman. He was immediately taken and executed on the same gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Divine justice had prevailed. Even with Haman dead, the decree ordering the destruction of the Jews was still in effect. I gathered my courage and approached the king once again. I fell at his feet and pleaded, "Let the plans of Haman be reversed and allow my people to defend themselves." Xerxes could not revoke the original decree, but he authorized a new one, allowing the Jews to organize and defend themselves. Under Mordecai's leadership, the new decree was sent to all the provinces. When the day arrived, the Jews faced their enemies and prevailed. The terror that could have spread through our communities gave way to celebration. The festival of Purim was instituted so that we would never forget how God turned our despair into victory. The days following our victory were filled with celebration and relief. The streets of Susa, which could have been the scene of tragedy, were now filled with songs, laughter, and dances. Our enemies had been defeated, and the shadow of Haman's decree had dissipated like mist under the morning sun. Yet, even amidst the joy, I knew this was not just our triumph. It was a victory that could only be attributed to divine intervention. I watched the city from the high balcony of the palace, wrapped in silence. The torches illuminated the faces of the people below, faces of families who could now breathe easy. I couldn't hold back the tears that began to roll down. "Why me, Lord?" I asked softly, looking up at the starry sky. "What did you see in me to place me in such a great role?" The answer seemed to be in the stars. It wasn't about who I was, but about what God could do through someone willing to trust in him. Mordecai, who now held the position once belonging to Haman, came to meet me. His posture was one of authority, but his expression still carried the same protective love he had always shown me. "You saved our people, Esther," he said, his eyes full of pride. I smiled, holding his hands. "It wasn't me, Mordecai. God saved us." He guided every word, every decision. He nodded but responded, "Yes, it was God. But he chose you, and you answered the call." The next day, we gathered our people to establish the festival of Purim. Mordecai led the ceremony, explaining the significance of that historic moment. "This is not just a day of celebration," he said, his voice firm and full of conviction. "It is a reminder that the Lord transforms fear into courage, injustice into redemption, and defeat into victory." The streets filled with dancing, laughter, and shared meals. Families recalled the unexpected twists, the ironies of divine justice that brought down Haman and exalted Mordecai. I walked among the people, seeing children playing, their faces free from the shadow of fear that had once hung over them. This sight filled my heart with a peace I can't describe. The years that followed were marked by a time of peace and prosperity for the Jews. Under Mordecai's leadership and the protection secured by the king, our people found security in an empire that once seemed hostile. As queen, I saw my role change. I was no longer just an ornament of the palace. I became an intercessor, a defender of those who had no voice. One night, while walking through the palace gardens, Xerxes joined me. He seemed more reflective than usual. "You've changed more than the fate of your people, Esther," he said, after a long silence. "You've shown me something I didn't see. That true power lies in courage and faith." His words touched me deeply. I smiled and replied, "I am nothing but a woman who trusted in God." Looking back, I see clearly how each moment was part of a greater plan. My story is not about my strength or wisdom, but about what God can do through someone who trusts in him, even in the midst of fear. Today, the festival of Purim continues to be celebrated, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, God can bring light and victory. If my story can teach anything, I hope it is this: never underestimate what God can do with your life, no matter how small or insignificant you may feel. If he could use a young Jewish girl hidden in a Persian palace to save a nation, imagine what he can do for you. If Esther's courage and faith have inspired you, imagine the wealth of wisdom waiting to be uncovered from other extraordinary women of the Bible. In the virtues of women in the Bible, timeless lessons for modern life, discover how women like Hannah, Ruth, Abigail, and Mary overcame extraordinary challenges with faith, love, and perseverance. Virtues that can transform your life today. Don't miss this opportunity to deepen your spiritual journey. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the first pinned comment to get your copy of this life-changing ebook now.